Hi everyone, MsMalcolmHughes here. Welcome back to episode 5 of the article Roundup, where this time we will be discussing the protests in Iran and understand exactly what's happening there. So let's get into it. So, first up, just looking over here, what we have, we're going to discuss two pieces today. One is an article, and one is actually a video that I think everyone should check out. So first starting out, right? The protests in Iran. This is an article from my one of my alma maters, the University of Pennsylvania, and the historian that we have here is an expert on modern Iran and then also on gender studies in the School of Arts and Sciences. And they discuss here why the protests sparked and why they're important. And I thought it was a pretty good read. It doesn't go too in depth, but it hits the major points that we should all consider. And so, first, we just start with an overview of the protests for those of you who may not be familiar. So, protests, give me 1 second. So, we have it here on the screen, and then I'm going to read it as well. Right. So, protests have erupted in dozens of Iranian cities after the death earlier this month, or this was actually last month, of a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman, Masa or Zina Amini, who was detained by the country's morality police for not fully complying with Iran's veiling laws and as far as covering and wearing the hijab, what they deem properly. Demonstrations against the death of Amini have led to violent police crackdowns with arrests, beatings, and the killing of at least 40 people, although human rights organizations say that number is much higher. There have also been internet outages and disruptions to cut the protesters' communication with the outside world. So the question then becomes, why did Amini's death spark such intense and risky protest across the nation, and where will it end? So for me, this actually happened back in September. For me, when I think about that, and it becomes discussed a little bit more later as well, is that it's never just about one moment, right? Even if you look back to the protests that we had during the pandemic here in the US, it's never about that one singular event. It is that event that is the culmination of multiple events, and it's that pressure point, that boiling point where it's reached fever pitch and the people are so frustrated that they can't take anymore. And that's exactly what we see here as far as just every country does things differently, but even to have something that's called the morality police, right? And so, really understanding the parameters that are put on women in this society. And it's just so interesting. I love history because if you go back, you'll notice how things change over time to fit those in power. So, right now, you have the morality police who are enforcing that individuals wear their veilings to the standards that they deem appropriate. But if you go back in Iran's history, there's also a period where the hijab was outlawed, right? And so the policing of women's bodies everywhere in the world where this occurs, not even this, but the policing of women's body where it occurs throughout the world is so problematic because it's always at the whims of men and those in power. And that's a problem. But let's continue talking about what's happening in Iran. And so our next slide really asks an important question, and it's, why did this killing inspire such intense protests? And this is what the professor says. People have a lot of pent up frustration with the regime, and it took a violent and unjust killing such as the murder of Masa Amini to ignite a massive protest movement. Actually, the history of modern Iran is replete with comparable protest movements that began with a local event that gained traction and became a catalyst for political change. Iranian women have stood at the forefront of politics throughout the country's modern history. People forget that even in the oil crisis of 1951 to 1953, for example, women's suffrage was among the demands of the protesters. And so, as we will continue reading this, but just talking about it's so frustrating because people always try to control women or even write women out of the history books and out of these movements. But women have always been involved. Women have always fought for the liberation of themselves and others. And so that's why I think it's such a betrayal and a slap in the face. But let's continue. So, Iranians, and particularly youth, have been frustrated with all manner of things. The pandemic has intensified the economic pressures on Iran, which already were monumental. Hardworking women and men feel the impact of the sanctions in a way that elites never do. Today's protests represent a movement about freedom. This is a movement about women's rights, but also about resistance to violence against women and resistance to political repression. At a time when we see a retrenchment of women's liberties all over the world, Iranian women have taken the lead in the fight for political freedom. The protest in memory of Mahsa Amini and all the other demonstrators who have sacrificed their lives serve as a powerful call to action, especially because women themselves are now the agents of change. And so that's the thing too, right? So here we have these women, or here we have this woman who was murdered. But as this continues, there are more women being murdered, there are more people being murdered, there are more young women being murdered. There are two 16-year-old young women, two independent stories, but who have resisted and fought back against the veiling law and have gone up missing and later were found dead, have gone missing and were later found dead. So it's problematic. And you cannot rule forever through suppression, through forced submission. That's not how it works. And the people will eventually resist. We see this time and time again. And so, as we sit here and try to unpack what exactly is happening, we get the question here of why, we get the question here of what is most important for Americans to understand about what's happening. And so we'll close with this. Americans need to understand that many Iranians are fed up with the failures of their government. A pervasive sense of anger and exasperation has compelled the youth, in particular, to fight for a better future. Right now, Americans need to abandon the notion that Iran and America will forever be at loggerheads. Instead, it is crucial for the United States to try and embrace a movement that is grassroots in nature and represents the good fight. America should not be cautious about standing with Iranian protesters, especially women. This is the people's fight, a battle for justice, freedom, and women's rights. It is a fight for giving people the freedom of choice. It is a fight against oppression and a fight for the future of a nation and its people. The American people need to rally behind this call and take a stance against injustice. I think that surmises it perfectly and is why I'm discussing it. I think that, especially when I was younger, I really was like, I have to leave the US. I want to go. I want to feel free. But every place has its own problems. And there are some places that have different problems that feel better for a spell, but every place has its own problem. So I say that to say that it is extremely important that we support each other, that we stand against oppression no matter where it happens, anywhere in the world, to any group of individuals. It is important that we take a stance against it, that we are aware of what's happening, and that we all choose to contribute in the ways that we can. And turning a blind eye to it does not save you, and it does not help others. And so, in addition to this article, I just wanted to share this one video. It's from Vice. You could find it over on YouTube, but it's really asking the question of, it's answering really that the woman-led uprising in Iran continues. There's a part one to this as well where it gives the initial overview when it first happened. But I thought this did a great job of really highlighting and going over everything that is happening on the ground, really making sure that the individuals who are being unjustly murdered, that we're seeing the actual lens of what's happening. So I definitely think if you want more in-depth general understanding of what's happening in visual form, I think we all know Vice for their documentaries. So I think it's really, really worth watching. So definitely check it out if you're looking for more information on what's occurring. And also ways that you can support. So this is what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. Just really short. This is my article roundup. One topic, one subject, but I think it's an important one, and I think it's one that we should all be aware of, because nothing happens in isolation, and we live in a global society, and it impacts all of us more than we sometimes think about. So that's it for me. Wanted to come and do that. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If there are any articles or any topics that you'd like me to discuss, please just drop them in the comment box below. And I hope everyone takes care, and I'll catch y'all in the next one. Peace.